Today's guest, Jock Brocas, is a paranormal and grief researcher, as well as an evidential medium. As a sought-after speaker, his lectures on grief, the afterlife, and the paranormal resonate deeply, offering profound insights grounded in academic research with experience and empathy. Jock also writes for several international magazines and is the founder of the globally respected Paranormal Daily news. He's also the author of books in spirituality and the afterlife. His books are titled Deadly Departed, Powers of the Sixth Sense, The Book of Six Rings. He's also podcast host of the Pillars of Grief podcast and Deadly Departed, which I had the honor of being a guest on, and it was a really fun conversation. He's even had an NDE, which he shares the details of for the very first time in this podcast. He loves science, research, he's participated in experiments, he's skeptical, and he's a medium. So this is a fascinating person to talk to, and I think all of you will really enjoy this episode. This episode does have a content warning. We do touch upon murder and suicide. Jock also discusses his thoughts on negative energies on the other side. And I know some people can find that really disturbing. It's towards the end, and I'll give a warning right before we get to that part in case you don't want to listen. Welcome to What the Fuck Just Happened. I'm your host, Liz Enton. If you listened to the intro, you know my story. If not, here's a brief summary. I'm a sciencey-skeptic, and when my dad died, I took a shot in the dark and decided to investigate if there was any possible evidence of an afterlife. I assumed that was as realistic as Santa Claus, but I was desperate. However, I was so blown away by what I discovered that I wrote a book and launched this podcast. In this podcast, I'll be talking to some fairly normal people about some really weird shit. I speak with everyone from psychic mediums and afterlife researchers to ordinary people who've had some inexplicable experiences. So come, listen. There's no need to draw any final conclusions. Keep an open mind and wonder, what the fuck? Hi, everyone. Today I'm talking with Jock Brocas, and he is an evidential medium, researcher, has a great podcast that I was honored to be on as well.
Yes, Liz has been on Deadly Departed, my podcast, and you'll be listening to this later, but we're launching it tonight at 7 p.m. So this will already be launched, and I have to say, I had an amazing conversation with Liz. It was thoroughly enjoyable, and one of the great podcast episodes that I've done. So please go and listen to it because it's a very natural phone conversation, as this is going to be. So Liz, thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, and thank you for saying such nice things. So I want to get into it. First of all, you had an interesting. I just think your journey is very interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were raised very, very religious. You believed in God and religion. You noticed you had mediumship abilities, and now you're a medium and a scientific researcher, and you have a completely scientific approach. That is some stuff I want to delve into today.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I mean, my uncle was a monk in a monastery. My granny in Scotland was a convert. My father was a high-ranking Masonic, Mason. My mother Catholic, and so if you think about it, there's a whole kind of Heinz 57 variety. There was a whole mix. But I always had a spiritual outlook to the whole of life, and of course, when you're young, you don't really understand it or anything. But I used to go to mass regularly. I used to go to church regularly. And from a young age, I was like, I wanted to follow in the footsteps of my uncle. and join the Redemptorist order, become a priest, etc., etc. So the minute that I could get involved in religious groups heading towards the priesthood, I did. And when I was young, when kids were going on holidays or and playing outside and playing soldiers and football and stuff, I mean, I had an altar in my room or made altars in the back of my garden. I was hearing mass, and as a young kid, that's the kind of thing I used to do. And I spent most of all my youth in the monastery. Wherever I could, I went to the monastery. I lived with the monks. When people were on retreats, I helped on retreats. I fed the poor. I prisoners that came to the monastery, I spent time with them. So I was steeped very, very much into a dogmatic persuasion, a dogma. But what I was being taught and what they were explaining to me didn't really sit with me, because I was having experiences. Now, I'll say, and you hear this cliche all the time, Liz, is that, when did you know you're a medium? Well, I've always been a medium since I was a kid, and I was that since I was a kid. Well, I kind of think that's a bit of a cliche, because when I was so young at that age, I didn't know what a medium was or what a psychic was or anything like that. I was steeped in religion. But I was having experiences I couldn't explain. And so it didn't add up in the religious side of things, So I guess I was a kind of problem student for all the priests and the nuns and things like that. I was there and arguing the point with them all the time. So, but eventually I went into groups, and I was going to take holy orders and officially go into the monastery. And my uncle passed. And I've been brought up with grief for all my life, because my mother nursed all her family to death. I used to go in and sing at the side of them, pray with as they were dying. Also, so I've been intimately acquainted with it. But my uncle passing in the monastery, I kind of took that really quite hard. And so the order says, you're not ready to take any orders or to come in. We want you to go and go out and experience the world and come back to us in a year or two, and then come back into it. So I was a bit annoyed and a bit angry with that, and so I fell into instead I'll join the army. So I joined the army.
Wait, I have to back up though and ask a quick question, and I want to hear also about the army. But what were, even if you didn't have the word psychic or medium as a child, what were some of the really big, what I say, what the fucks, weird things that happened that was giving you evidence that there was something valid to an afterlife, not just, religion?
I remember this experience was really quite strong. I remember when I was in the monastery one time, and the room that I used to stay in was way up in the attics. And if you've ever, anybody can go on my site, and I think they can see a picture of it. I used to stay in this room right up in the attics, and the attics were a scary place, right? Because it was away from everybody else, all the retreat people, and it was quiet. Everything was kind of squeaky, and you looked at the pictures of the saints and the statues, you thought they were looking at you and judging you. So it was kind of, a bit scary up there. But I remember I got up one night, I was bursting for the loo, and I thought I better run. And the thing is I had to come out of my room and then turn right, run up the hallway, and then run down to the left. And then halfway down the hallway is where the toilets would be. And I remember getting out there and running around, and I kind of stopped. And right at the end of the hallway, I seen this priest, this monk, who seemed to come straight across the hallway and then go straight through and disappear. And so I waved and it's like, "Hello, Father. How are you doing?" And there was nothing. There was no waving back. There was no expression. There was nothing there. But I felt as if it could, whatever it was, would be able to see me and knew that I was there, because as it passed through, it was confusing, because there was like no door there. It was just a wall. It was just like an apparition that just went through. And I didn't know this at the time. So I remember when it was the next day, and I thought, well, I before I went back to my room, I thought, I was a bit ignorant. He never said that. And I'd never seen this monk, this priest before. I was a bit ignorant. So I remember telling my one of the brothers, Brother Pius, And then I was shown a picture, the rector had showed me a picture of this priest and of course this monk. And well, they had died. They had, it was the exact image that I had picked out, and they had gone like way before even my time. So then I got in.
You never saw a photo of them before, so
No.
maybe you had an unconscious memory of them? No.
No, nothing. I was really shocked because I was complaining that they never said hello or anything, just ignored. And when I was showing that picture, it was like from years and years and years ago, like the 18th century. But I mean, that place had been built since the 1700s. It was really, and there was a miracle happened there apparently as well with the water and stuff. I never seen it before. And then I got into the whole lecture about, then I was lectured about when there's other things on the other side, you've got to be aware, and, this could be good, but there's, there can be evil over there, or there's could be bad spirits. And, then kind of it was complicated, you don't have to believe everything you see. And it just got more confusing. But that sparked something in me like, I want to know. Because what they're saying is not adding up. And a lot of these experiences then I'd be having was, I had a drive to know that, to find more about this knowledge. And I remember when we were going on retreats, and when we were in a group for young boys that wanted to become priests, all of them would say that they were seeing visions of Jesus and visions of Mary and visions of saints. And they would go down to the grotto and pray, and they would have these experiences. And I was like, it don't add up. It don't make any sense. So I would like pray for these experiences myself and think, well, sod it, I'm going to go down there and do what they were doing. And I would go down, I get my rosary beads out, and I go down to and I'd kneel in front of the statue, and I'll be like, okay, so let's go for it. Let's see what's happening. And I would get nothing. So I was starting to think, they're basically bullshitting, I think, here. I wouldn't use that phrase at the time, but, this is not true. And so it led me into even more of wanting to know more about that side of things.
Then you said you joined the army. And I know you had a weird experience. Yeah. Well, I want to hear about it too, but I know I read in your book, which I confess I still have to finish, but you had an evidential kind of weird experience there with a drunken night. And I mean, tell us a little bit about maybe some evidence you had in the army.
You can't really, it's a thing when I was in the military, you can't really talk about things like that, because in my time, it was, you just didn't talk about stuff. I mean, that was just not, that didn't happen. But I remember me and the boys one night, we were out and we were, out in the beer and having a good time. And we were drunk, and we come back into camp and we were hungry and there was nothing opened. And I was in the headquarters at the time, and I was like, you know what, we can get. I know that there's a window that's open at the back. We'll get in there and we'll go in, and I can go into the offices, and I know where this lass has left her lunch time, so we'll go and nick that lunch. So we'll go and pinch it. And I remember getting in there, and it was weird because as we were going down the hall, and my guys, I could see this old soldier right at the back, and it just passed and went straight through again. It was just like played over, and it was in Sir John Moore Barracks in Folkestone. And the guys that I was with, I'm sure they could see the same thing, because it was like fleeting, but you could make it out really clear. And we were drunk, and I was like, what was that? And then we got into Marwood, there's nothing there, and I turned around to them, and they were like, did you hear something? I was like, yeah, well, we better go. We're going to get caught, because we'd essentially broken in, because there was a window that was left open at the back. And really from that time on, I then realized that, wait a minute, was I experiencing that and they didn't? I started to question it. But did they just think, well, did we hear a noise because we heard something together? And there was nobody in there at the time. This was like stupid o'clock in the morning, because we were drunk, essentially. So you can't say that there was a lot of lucidity with us because we were drunk, but the experience kind of wakes you up in the moment, because we thought we got caught. It turns out there was nobody in there. There was actually nobody even that was in. There was no security that was doing any controls or nothing. So that, and I think in a lot of the places that I'd been in the military, I had experiences of phenomena that couldn't be explained. But in the military, you can't talk about that. Like we couldn't go to the RSM or Sergeant Major or anybody else and say, hey, this is what happened, because we were doing things that were naughty that shouldn't have been occurring at this, at any given time anyway. But I always had this feeling in some of the old barracks and places that we're in that there was more than us there, and that we were being, that something was watching us, and that there was things that would happen. You would hear random knocks, and of course you have to think, is this just because it's an old place and things happen and heat changes things, conduction and stuff like that? But some of the experiences were so unique that it didn't really fit any kind of science. So again, that gave me a lot of interest. There was one time where I heard a knock, and it didn't seem to come from anywhere from the heating pipes or anything else, because I remember asking the question and asking for a response, and I seemed to get a response. It knocked on the response, and so that kind of made me a bit confused, because I couldn't figure out anything else that was happening. I couldn't figure out. You've always got to think: is it going to be heat? Is other people moving around? I mean, these are really, really old buildings. But I seemed to, when I looked for a response, I would get a response. And it didn't seem to happen with anybody else. There was anybody else in my platoon or in my unit that maybe had that experience. So perhaps that was a sign of my mediumistic abilities at the time. So, and I didn't know, I couldn't label it, but it was making me interested. And I would, I had the experience of what I'd seen, and now I had an experience of a knock that seemed to respond to my questions, and it just threw me into a whole lot of interest, and I started to research into things even then.
What do you mean by research? What would you do?
Reading books. I started because I've always been a reader, and I've always liked old books. So, and of course, I didn't really know what parapsychology or anything was at the time. So I would get books on spirituality, because even when I was young in the monastery, well, people were reading comics and storybooks. I used to read Vacation to the Priesthood, or I used to read really kind of heavy stuff. And then I can't remember the name of it, but I bought a book on witchcraft, and I was looking at that. And then I started to look at other books that I would get from either, in shops down in Kent, or in even a library or stuff like that. So I couldn't steep myself into massive research, because I was a soldier and I had things to do. I mean, we had parades, we had all sorts of things to do, but it was always there. And the experience was always there, and I wanted to know more. And so I would look at, sometimes you would pick up a book on the local area of famous hauntings, and especially, here was the thing, in sink ports. Oh, I tell you about another experience I had, which was really weird. So part of my service, I was in the protection. I helped with the protection team with the Queen Mother. And I spent time in sink ports in one of the castles. And it was in Deal Castle. And the Queen Mum was coming down, and we were doing all the searches. And this is a really, really old castle. And I remember feeling really strange in one of the rooms in the castle that we were doing all searches and clearance for. Even though it was sunshine, even though it was a good weather and it was sunshiny, and we had tents outside and we were doing all the IED, there was one room that felt really cold and really chilly, and really there was something about it. And I remember going in there, and I never seen any apparitions or anything like that at this time, but my hair stood on end, and I could feel this pressure, the temperature dropped dramatically, and I had this feeling of being watched. And it was like, I don't like it in here. This is eerie. I got to get out. So, and that was in Deal Castle. when the Queen Mother was there. So that was an experience, and that made me more interested. So I would then start to look at local things. And apparently in Kent at the time, there was some books out. I also can't remember the name of them then, but there was a lot of haunting stories of the Cinque Ports area during the war, because that was Dover, Deal, all these areas that were fundamental places and strategic places for World War II. So there was loads of stories. There was stories about underground caverns, hallways that were used for special services, and that people had died in there. So it was really crazy.
Well, and so now, and I know you haven't really talked about this before, but obviously you've had a big turning point. You had a near-death experience, an NDE.
Well, actually, I was a medium then when I had an NDE, but I was a young medium, and I'd been developing. But here was the thing. I never really ever spoke, and I've never spoke about this publicly to this depth. I've mentioned it, so I'm happy to bring this out on yours. And one of the reasons I never we did a story on a magazine many years ago after what had actually happened to us about this NDE, and I remember it was really strange, because it was when things took a dramatic turn in my development and a dramatic turn in my life. It was a whole transformational process.
And you'd been a medium already, because I guess I just made an assumption it was after your NDE. You completely went to the next level.
Absolutely, completely went to the next level after that. And it was not just in mediumship, it was a whole kind of life transformation. And what was really strange was, and I never ever really wanted to speak of this, because even then I was still a very evidential type scientific person, that I wanted evidence of what we were doing. And, I believed in orbs. I believed in everything. Every phenomena that I could get when I was a young medium, I just thought it was spirit everywhere, until you really start to learn the science. But I never really wanted to go into this, because I always thought, okay, well, there's so many people have NDEs, and there's very little science on it, and there's very little evidence. And a lot of people will say they have an NDE, but have no genuine evidence of it. And the ones that do is the ones that you go, well, like Dr. Ibn Alexander and, people like that who have got empirical evidence where they've come back with something, or they've healed a disease or whatever it is. I never had all that. So I kept on saying, well, I got no proof. So why should I go out there and, tell about it, write a book or anything like that? But what was really strange was, it was, I think about, I want to say 8 weeks or 10 weeks before my wife and I were getting married. And the weather was quite bad. It was snowy, and Joe had said to me, we got to go up and get the wedding cake sorted, and we had to go to, and we wanted to go for lunch and stuff. And we had this feeling not to go because the weather was quite rough. But I got outside the house and I was like, you know what? I'll dig the car out of the snow. And we had a little sports car at the time. I dig the car out of the snow, and I dug the car out of the snow, and the car wouldn't start. First warning, felt as if I shouldn't go. Totally ignored it, and I'm sure Spirit was trying to let us know not to go. So no, it wouldn't happen. And then so we drove up the hill. We managed to get it clear, drove up the hill a little bit, and the car broke down and started to slide back, right? So that was second warning, better not go. Something was telling us not to go. But we were so egotistical. It was like, no, we're going to have lunch, be nice lunch. We'll get away. We'll get the cake done, and we'll be done. And so we got up there and we got out onto the road, and it seemed like the snow plows had been up and everything was kind of clear, but there was still drifts either side. And we decided to, okay, we'll just go. We'll be fine. We drove down a few miles down the road, broke down again. Thought, right, okay, maybe we should be turning back here. All right, we'll just go. We'll rough it. We'll get there, no problem. So we're on the way. We're driving. And we're driving to this little village outside in Aberdeenshire. And we break down again. And this time we're pulled over at the side of the road and it starts snowing. And we're like, okay, we'll just phone the RAC, which is like the recovery company. So we decided, we contact the RSA, we broke down, we need help and everything else. And they said that they were going to get there as soon as possible, but they didn't know how long it would be. And what happened? So we were sitting, Joe was reading a book. We're just sitting waiting. It started snowing. And I wasn't thinking of anything. And all of a sudden, I heard my father call my name. Now, my father had passed and had passed over from the other side. And I heard my name objectively outside of me, very loud. And I got a shock. And I looked in the mirror and I saw this massive truck. It was like like 16, a big truck. And it was coming toward us. And it literally, this is different. So it literally hit us. But at that time, I never felt any of the impact because I was immediately taken out of my body. And I eventually had the experience where I then could see everything went in slow motion, like the Matrix. Totally slow motion. And I was above the vehicle. And it was really surreal because everything around me was light. It felt so translucent, so light, so loving. And I felt really weird. I felt I was connected to everything. There was no distinction and there was no distance, there was no separation. And I felt like I was held. I felt like I was held in somebody's arms. I felt like I was held in angel's arms. And it was so weird because then I could see everything. I could see above the vehicle. I could see the truck driver. It was really strange. And then I felt like that. I didn't know that I had died or if anything had happened. It just felt that there was this massive expanse in this amazing light that was around us. And I could feel the beings around me, and I could feel like there was something that was protective, that was watching over me. And I never seen any different area of the spirit world and met all these beings and all that kind of stuff. It was kind of weird. I felt as if I was getting pulled up and pulled away. And then I wondered what was happening. And then I heard, "John's not your time." And I looked down and I saw my wife in the car, and I panicked because I needed to get back to her. And before I knew it, even though I was connected to everything, this light, this experience, I heard these beings, I heard this voice, and I knew my father was there because I could feel my father, and I heard him. But then there was this other voice, and it was like, "It's not your time." And as I was pulled away, as I was going up, I could still see everything over that was happening. And I saw my wife in the vehicle, and I panicked. I was like, she's not my wife yet, but it was before the wedding. And I literally, the minute I felt that connection that I needed to be with her, I was brought back into the vehicle, and I kind of and I remember pushing Joe out of the vehicle into the snow. And I then came down, and I just kind of come to. And the weird thing was, an ambulance arrived moments that as I got back, an ambulance had arrived. And there was no one around there. There was just the guy in the truck. And I don't know if he phoned an ambulance, or it didn't look like he did because he wasn't on the phone. He was outside going towards our vehicle with nothing. And I could see all this from above. But the thing is that when Joe was pushed out and I came back, the car was absolutely totaled. It was destroyed. The back wheel was cut in half like it had a circular saw. It was concertinaed. She was out in the snow. I fell out of the door. And not one of us had a serious injury. We were taken into the hospital. We were taken into the ambulance that was there, and they were checking everything else. And I had a bit of a compressed chest, and I'd hit my head, so I was bleeding and everything from my head, but broke no bones, nothing, other than bruising and the way that I'd hit. Now, when it happened and it was in slow motion, as I came back in that moment, I knew that my head had gone forward and had hit the steering wheel. But now the steering wheel had actually come up and gone through, literally through the roof and the back window. The car was, they couldn't believe it. So when the police arrived and things were that there, they could not believe that we had survived. There was no way, they said there was no way that we should have survived that. Absolutely no way in God's earth should we have survived that crash. But we did, and we survived. And the hospital couldn't believe it. We had literally no serious injuries at all. I remember laughing because the doctor or the paramedic had said, your nose is quite straight, son. Don't worry about it. I said, well, that's great because it was fucking broke. It was bent before. so the experience, Liz, and I never spoke about it really because I never had any massive proof of anything. And I kept it quiet for years, but I'll never forget. And I only really I wrote about this in a paper that I did for university because I didn't write it as my name. I wrote it as like person X kind of thing. But the reality is that the interconnectedness that I felt, the light that I saw, that wasn't in a tunnel. It was all around. It was It was everywhere. It was so intense, and the protectiveness and the unconditional love that I felt was phenomenal. I knew my father was there, but there was more than my father there. More than my father, and the voices I heard were undeniable. And after that, there was a massive transformation in me. Massive. I felt connected to everything and everyone, and still do.
You said you saw. Did seeing... I've been reading books that seeing is a little different at times during NDEs, such as 360 degrees vision that we can't really understand as people. Or was it the same as seeing?
No.
As if we were to like take a plane above and
float
it. How would you describe sensory input? Let's start with seeing.
Oh, okay. So how would I explain this? Because you think, okay, so you know what it's like to look through like a fisheye lens, and it kind of takes everything up, right? There was no like looking forward and seeing. It was like everything could be seen. Everything was connected. Any thought and anything I had was immediately acted upon. And so it wasn't like I was looking out of eyes. It was like I could perceive everything in that moment visually and lucid, but there was no looking forward or looking to the side or looking. It was like anything. Everything was available. And as I looked, so you imagine like as I'm looking below, it's like that experience of seeing everything in a fisheye type lens with this translucence and this light that's around. And wherever my mind connected to, or wherever my thought, or wherever it was immediately there.
And you still felt conscious as an individual. I know sometimes you hear we're all one, which some people seem to find beautiful. I find horrible. I like the idea of remaining an individual.
I had no doubt. Yeah, no, I had consciousness. I wasn't sharing the mind of someone else. I knew it was my wife to be that was in that vehicle. I could see everything, and essentially, as I'm using that word, openly about seeing, but it's not like seeing with your eyes. It's like perception of everything in that moment, or wherever your energy or your conscious or your thought or your mind connects with, you immediately know. Do you know what it's like? It's like a clear cognizance. It's like a knowing rather than questioning a clairvoyant image or anything else. It's like immediately knowing, no gray area, nothing. You're just immediately, you're connected. And so that was phenomenal. And I would definitely 100% say to people out there that I definitely had separate, personality, my consciousness was definitely mine. It wasn't anybody else's. I shared and I was interconnected with everything, but it was the sense of I in the greater connectedness, if you understand,
I never like when they're like, we're just all one. We're not individuals. I mean, if that's the truth, it doesn't matter if I like it or not, but I'm relieved to hear that.
No, I was individual. Yeah.
Did it feel as real as this life? Like, I know I have some intense or vivid dreams, but they don't feel as real as my sitting right here, right now.
So the thing with consciousness is our consciousness comes in different ways, and we've kind of spoke about the whole idea, you and I, about the mind and the brain, or the brain and the mind. So as I'm sitting here, I am conscious and I'm aware of the experience. The level of consciousness over there when that happened was completely unique. It was different. It was. I wasn't separate from it. I mean, I had my own identity, but I could experience it, and it was more vivid than anything that I would experience now in this moment of our awareness. It really didn't feel like there was any separation. It felt that there was no distance from anything, that everything was connected, and it was probably more real, if I could want it's difficult to say, really, because I know a lot of people will come and they'll let their ego fly with their experience and try, like you say, try and put in this oneness and all this kind of stuff. Well, I had my identity, but I can only say that I was connected to whatever that was. I was connected, and it felt more real than anything that I would experience in this life.
That seems to be a consistency that people who have near-death experiences say, that it's realer than real, which I find encouraging.
It is, and it's weird because there's nothing that I can say that, because like I said, this is the first time I really went in depth with it, because I never really had any. I wasn't in a hospital floated up and could tell them. I did tell the cops and the paramedics about the guy, which they were a bit strange with, because they were like, "How the heck did you know that?" Because I could tell them details that I would never have known, because I should have been comatose and I should have been out in the vehicle. So that was a bit strange for them. But it's very difficult to say how how you can really how can I exemplify something in this world, in this moment, in this reality that goes against the grain of everything we know in science,
which seems to keep happening as we delve into this research constantly.
Exactly.
I also want to ask you about your wife. So did she was fine too, and she must have been impacted. Did she have an NDE? I mean, how was she okay?
She was out. She went unconscious a bit. When she came round, she gave me a row for pushing her into the snow. But she never felt the cold or anything like that, because I pushed her out, but she never had the experience that I had. But she came to in the snow, and luckily she never felt anything, because as that moment that had the impact, I believe I jumped in front of her, and it was almost like my dad pushed me in front of her. And again, I have no proof of that, Liz, but I felt something throw me forward in front of Joe. And so, again, is that did I concoct that in my own mind, or, no, I mean, I really feel in my own experience that I was pushed by a force, whether it be my father, whether it be an angel, whether it be something that threw me in front of Joe and stopped her. Because essentially, even when people were looking at the vehicle, or when the cops said that, they said Joe should have went straight through the windscreen, and she didn't.
That's amazing. you said your mediumship transformed after your NDE, but let's back up a little bit. How did you first become a medium, realize this is what I'm doing, this is my career?
This was weird. Okay, so go back. So I got divorced from my first wife. I'd left the military. I had, different experiences. I was getting on in life, and I was alone for a while, and I worked as a bouncer on a door. Right, I was a bouncer in a nightclub, and I was working with this lass Alison. She's lovely, and she was studying to be a lawyer in Aberdeen University, and she said to me, "I'm going to go for a psychic reading with this woman called Rachel Frass," and I was like, oh, right. She says, "Will you drive me on Saturday?" I says, "No, I'm all right. I'm not. I don't believe in that crap. We're not going to go to that, So I had fallen into the material world, right? And this is way before the end year end. I was falling into the material world. That's rubbish. I was with the boys. We trained. We were on, She says, "Oh, come on, Jock. Just drive us up there because we're on the door that night. We'll go up there. We'll have something to eat, and then we'll go to your place, and then we'll go to work later." I said, "Oh, all right, I'll drive you." So I drove her out. We drove out into the mountains of Scotland and Aberdeenshire, and it was like freaking Hansel and Gretel. So we're getting up into this turning into this little mini road that's going away up into the hills, and there was this little cottage next to like a wooded graveyard area and it was like looked really freaky. I was like, "Oh, this is a bit kind of strange and weird, this kind of thing." But eventually we passed that graveyard in the trees, and she had this cottage that sat up in a hill. And I drove into her driveway, and Alison was like, I'm going in for my reading now." And she went, I was just sitting outside. I was like, "Oh, what a load of bollocks this is going to be." And she came out and she looked really shocked, and she was amazed about what had been told. And the woman looked at me and she says, "You're next." And I'm like, "I'm not going for this. This just is not up my street. There's no chance." She says, No, come on, I've got a message for you." I said, "I'm not paying nothing." And so she took me, and Alison's going, "Go on." I said, "Oh, in for a penny, in for a pound, I'll go in." So I went in, I sat in her room, and I was absolutely shocked. She looked at me, she had these playing cards. And I thought, what the heck is she going to do with them? She took out these playing cards, and I thought, we're going to play Snap or something, or we're going to play poker, or whatever it is. I was just not ready for this. And all she did, she just turned the playing cards over, and she turned around, she looked at me, she said, "I've got your father here, Alec." And I was like, "Holy shit, what?" And she proceeded to tell me information that no one would have known. Not one person. She told me stuff that I mean, I was involved with certain things that were not widely known, were under secrecy and stuff like that. And it totally blew me away. It totally shocked me. And she says, "It's time to come home. You've got this gift. You've been like this ever since you were young." And she says, "I want to do something with you." And she took me into her kitchen, and she said, "Sit down." And she telling me some stuff, and she opened up the drawer, and she took out a ring from this drawer. And she says, "I want you to sit there, but I want you to sit there and put this in your left hand." I said, and then she talked me through like a little meditative process. And she says, "Tell me what you see in your mind." I was just sitting there, and I was bearing in mind that she'd just blown me away what she just told me, my father. I was really kind of really worried then. So I then there's a calmness came over me, and I was holding it, and I started to see things in my mind. I started to pick up information, and I would just tell her what I would see. And she basically told me after that, the information I gave her was connected to her husband. Her husband had passed, and that was her details. And I gave I can't remember the name, but I gave the name of the husband. And she told me that what I had done was called psychometry. She says, "You're a medium, and you've always been a medium. And you'll get a visitation. You'll have an awakening." And I think it was like she'd said within a year or two. And it was not long. I think it was about a year afterwards. I had this experience. I came home, and I was sitting down, and I'd lost my father, obviously. And the grief didn't hit me until way, way later, because my father and I fell out before he passed. And so I never got to say goodbye, and it was bad words between us before his passing. And I was sitting in my room in Scotland, and the figure, he appeared in full objective view of me seeing him. And I have to say, it frightened the shit out of me, because I thought, he's dead. And there was no words, there was no communication, it was just a smile.
Hey everyone! I'm really excited to let you know about the Science and Spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@WTFJustHappened.net and put science and spirituality in the
And then I remember it was, a mate of mine that we used to work in the door, Willie McGowan, and a great guy. And we used to take a piss out of this. There was and other guys, there was a spooky church. I didn't know it was a spiritualist church at the time. And I remember going down, after I had that experience, I went down there, and this old woman kind of looked at me and had this sense of it. The door was locked. I could hear music. Everybody was in there. It was locked. But I remember banging on this door, and this old woman opened it and just looked at me with a sense of expectation, like she was waiting for me, and took me into the back room. And there was a divine service going on, which I didn't know was a divine service at the time. And there was this couple up on platform. It was a husband and wife. And I'll never forget, I was right up the back, and I had this leather jacket on, and I was trying to hide away from everybody. And the woman looked directly at me, and she says, "I want to come to that gentleman up there. You that's trying to hide away from everybody that's just come in late." She said, "I have your father here." And then she started to tell me all this information. She says, "And there's doors opening for you, and you'll be standing on a platform like this in the not too distant future." And that was my introduction into mediumship. And I will tell you this, though, the person who trained me, and I've got to say this, I sat in circle, I was in a spiritualist church, I found it very cliquey. When I met my wife, who I didn't know was my wife at the time, obviously, I had done Reiki, and I'd opened up spiritually, and, I had found that, you have these shapes that fit into, all my life I'd been trying to fit the round ball into the star shape, and it would never fit. But now I felt like I'd come home. The square fit in the square, the orange fit in the circle, and I felt like I'd come home. And I remember I was getting into crystals and stuff like that. I thought I quite like the crystals, and I quite like to meditate with them, because people would say in the church, hold a crystal and help me meditate. And I went into this shop, and I found this business card, this from a woman called, Joanne Sarah Pugsley. And I thought, she teaches psychic development. She's got a course. I thought, I'm going to go to that course. I was very skeptical even then. So even I wanted to check her out. I wanted to check everything out. I wanted to meet her, speak to her. I had to make sure there was no fraud going on and everything else even then. So I remember phoning her up and saying, let's meet and have a coffee and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, cut a long story short, I went on her psychic development course, and it was one of the best things I'd ever done. But Joe and I fell in love, and eventually, and I never wasn't looking for another partner. And I'll say that out of everybody I trained with, or everybody I went, Helen Gordon used to take me out to castles and do psychometry and teach me psychometry, and but my wife now was probably the greatest teacher I ever had. She took a bit of coal and she turned it into a diamond, and she made me the medium that I was. And before long, Joanne and I were demonstrating in churches and theatres and organisations and raising funds for. And I'll never forget, we met and we got married within a year, and then we've been together ever since.
I actually had no idea that your wife was a medium as well.
Phenomenal. She had developed as a medium ever since she was 16. She served this Christian Spiritualist church. We got married in the Christian Spiritualist church. Joe and I had our own Christian Spiritualist church in Scotland. We ran our own church, the Centre of Spiritual Light. And to this day, one of our students is actually still running it. We hand it over when we came to the US, but my wife now is not so much more on that side. She is heavily involved in healing and working on the healing side of things, and she's written a number of books. And I can't speak highly enough of her, because she was my greatest teacher and still is.
I should have her on this podcast if she'd be interested.
She probably won't come on. She don't go on any podcasts. It's taken me years for her to get to launch her own podcast, but she's been forced on a number of occasions on podcasts from her publishers and stuff like that. But she might, and saying that though, she might do because she's getting into it. And I've got her starting her own podcast called Angel Fire. And so she's done the first episode this week, which I am delighted about, and she's going to be putting it out there. So I'll send you her details. I'll send you her website, and maybe she will, because she's getting excited about doing a podcast.
Now, you were a medium. That's how you became a professional medium.
Yeah.
And I assume you were really good, but you became the next level after your NDE. Talk about life, how you got back into life and what started to happen after your NDE.
Oh, not long. Probably a couple of years, not long. I was young at the time. It was before we got married, and we got married. I mean, I'm now 52, right? So we got married when I was, God, Joe's going to kill me if she listens to this and I get my age wrong. Either 34 or 35. And at that time, I had only been a medium for a short space of time. So I want to say a couple of years.
So then you had your NDE. Now, you said you were transformed. How was your life transformed?
Do you know what was very difficult? Here's the thing, and I'm sure this happens with a lot of people that have NDEs. It was very difficult to come back into the realm of the material world. Because nothing really made sense of how we perceive it in this world. And I found that things wouldn't bother me as much. And I still felt, and I still do, I still feel that sense of interconnectedness. And when I teach a lot about connection and interconnectedness of all things. And I still feel that. And I remember after that, I was jogging around a place called in Bewley in Inverness. And I still had this profound sense of connection. And I remember asking Spirit, I want to hear you. I want to feel something even more from the experience. Because here's the thing: when you have these experiences, it's transitory. It doesn't exist for the rest of your life. Yes, you feel that connectedness. Yes, you feel that it's impacted you, but you're not living in that experience forevermore. And people that say they are, I don't think they are. I think that's their ego coming forward. But you're always striving to feel that again. And I remember I heard this voice. It was really crazy. I was doing like a jog around this place, and it was a little wooded area in Inverness. And I remember coming to this opening where there was a little waterfall and there was a little river stream that was coming down. Excuse me. And I sat down by this log and I started to meditate a little bit. And I said, "So, let me feel that you're here. Let me feel this presence again." And as I was starting to kind of go down a little bit, I honestly felt again that I had this connection, and I heard very clearly, what was it? And I've written this down. I'll need to send it to you because I wrote it down and I have it in a picture. And it was, "I am here. I am the whisper in the wind. I am the crying of a child. I am the flutter of a bird." And it was this prose that was very clear in my mind. And I remember
Like in your mind, or did you hear it as a voice?
So see, when you get, so this wasn't objective, this was subjective, but it felt completely unique and different outside of me. So it was like, you got a song in your head, but when you got a song in your head and you're singing it in your voice and you can kind of hear it in your voice. Well, this was distinct. This had a different pattern to it. This was not me, but it was subjective and it felt like it was pushed into mine. And I will send you what it was. And it was beautiful. And I remember coming out and I wrote down everything that I got. I'd taken a note because I used to carry a little notepad and pen everywhere I went. And that then was another experience that made me feel so interconnected just in that moment, where I felt as if I was allowed to feel it again. And at that moment, even when I was hearing those words, I could hear everything outside of me even more vividly than anything. Like you could hear the tweet of a bird. It felt as if miles away. I felt so connected in everything that it was doing. So I wrote that down, and it's never left me. And I've used it as a quote that I teach students all the time to prove to them that there's no separation from anything.
And is that a known quote? Is it one you could Google, or it's one that just came to you, or is it written somewhere?
No, it just came to me. It's not. It's only known by me, and it's actually in my images, and it's only been put out by me.
So all mediums, obviously, on a regular basis, have what the fucks and evidential experiences. Do you have one major what the fuck in a reading or evidence you got that stands out to you?
Yeah, do you know what? I can give you. I hate doing this, right? I really don't like talking about any readings that I've done because it irks me because it's. But I will do it because this is a what the fuck moment, right? So I used to. I mean, I used to do martial arts and I used to teach martial arts, and I remember. And I'd been working as a medium. I'd been doing a lot of stuff and everything else. And one of my students came up to me and he wanted a lift home, and I gave him a lift home. And I said to him, I think his grandmother came through, and I said, I know he'd lost his grandmother. He was suffering a little bit. I didn't know he'd lost his grandmother, but there was something off about him. And I remember saying, I got somebody's coming through here. Now, they knew I was a medium. And I said, I got somebody's come through who's got a nickname Bunty. And it was his grandmother. And I gave him some information. He was in tears and everything else. And I said, and she's talking about the letter that's been written by the gravestone. And he had no evidence of that. He had no idea of that. And it's from someone who's connected to the family that's been estranged from the family for a number of years. It was over 20 odd years. It was a long lost relative that was trying to find them, and they had they didn't know. He went home and he asked his mother about it, and they totally denied anything. Well, him and his mother went up to the gravestone and found that letter from a family member that they were trying to find. They were trying to find each other. And he lived in a little place outside Inverness. And they found that letter, and that letter was in an envelope, and it was addressed to them. And it was a relation that they hadn't been in contact with for over 25 years that had been looking for them. So I have to say that that's a kind of what the fuck moment. Because scientifically, that's pretty freaking strong. Because you can't then turn around and say, well, this was super consciousness or anything. I mean, Mum didn't know about it. He didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it. And just to have that little reading going back in the car, there was nothing. And they found that information.
And on another note, you recently wrote a rebuttal against materialism.
Yeah. There was an article come out in Psychology Today, and it was an article, someone, a PhD scientist, who was positing that the soul was part of the brain. And because I had ND experiences and because I had other experiences, I'm very passionate about the afterlife and things like that kind of really irked me, and I'd never written a rebuttal before. So I decided to write this article based on the experiences that I had and based on what I knew from science and, from these things. And I called it Defending the Soul because I felt I wanted to defend the soul. The soul is not being the brain. And so I called it Defending the Soul Against Materialist Science. And essentially what I basically said is that you can't claim that the brain is the seat of consciousness, or the brain is the seat of the soul, because I believe that the psychology, the mind is the psychological building blocks of our reality. And so the experiences that I knew from people who had near-death experiences, or who had brain injuries or anything else that had these other experiences, or even who had died, and mediumship experiences and mediumship that had given veridical evidence of the continuation of consciousness, did not lay up to his assumptions. And the material assumptions was that the neurons in the brain, and this is where and everything is basically your feeling, your emotion, everything is within the brain. So I kind of thought I've got to go on this rampage to protect the identity of the soul. And so I wrote an article called Defending the Soul. And basically one of the main things that I said is that, if a soldier is in battle and they're receiving information, and all of a sudden their radio receiver breaks, right? Doesn't mean that the signal is no longer there. Essentially, the radio is the brain, and it's only receiving the signal, and then it's going out for us to make an attachment to it, or to discern what was coming out of that machine. So there was no way that his assumptions would stand up really to science, because there was so much evidence. And so I went into NDEs, I went into the evidence and mediumship, and tried to blend in as much of a scientific perspective as I could. Now, bearing in mind, I hadn't been at university at this time, and I was writing academic papers based on my own knowledge. So a lot of people loved what I wrote and supported it. But of course, there was other scientists that kind of, I remember, kind of attacked us, and there was somebody from the SPR says, you got to understand that this guy's not an academic, and he's done a pretty good job at, coming from his experience point of view. So I was quite proud of that. I was proud of that some major scientists had either attacked me or supported me and actually backed me up and saying that, this guy's not an academic.
You mentioned the SPR, just so everyone knows, that's the Society for Cyclical Research. That's
a fantastic, fantastic organization, as is some other organizations as well. But so, I was very happy that they shared it, and it had the attention that it had. And I still stick by it. I still stick by what I said in there. Now, and if anybody wants to do it, go and read it, because, remember, it is written academically, but it's before I even went into academic studies. It is written from my experience, my knowledge, and my wisdom gained over the years. And I think I did a pretty good job on my very first rebuttal against a mainstream scientist. And I stand by it. I stand by my perception, or I will say my knowing, because I don't like to use the word belief, but my knowing is that the brain is a receiver, and the brain is an expression of divine mind.
Have you participated in any studies or research?
I have, but not at university levels, and maybe that'll change now that I'm steeped in university, because I have ideas and people that I'm speaking to about potential researches and trance and things like that. But I have taken part in some tests and some research tests. I have done with one scientist on communicating with pets, which was done and then was reported in New Dawn magazine.
Who was the scientist?
Rob Jeans, who's an environmental scientist. So it was basically, can we connect with pets on the other side? And so we did our own kind of thing from the magazine. And I was very surprised at the results that that came out of it, and we reported on it. But I was able to identify very personal traits within that pet, including its name, which was very unusual, very foreign, kind of Russian Norwegian type name, and personal identification of the attributes of that dog, and even when it came back. And I have done it in other readings before, where pets have shown up and I've given evidence. But please don't connect me. I don't want to do pet readings. I'm not really interested in that. I did this as a scientific research for an article that was being, that we were looking at, and it was successful. And maybe that's something I'll do in research again in the future. But again, I don't want to do pet readings. Because I think it's a difficult thing. Because for me, in my mind as well, it's like in my mind all the time, like I don't speak doggy and I don't speak cat and I don't speak horse. So how am I getting that information? For me, it's still I don't understand it, and it's still not adding up. I'm seeing clairvoyantly and hearing things, and I want. Am I getting it from my guide? Am I getting it from the actual pet directly? It still don't make sense to me. So I'd be interested in that in the future. I did one, and my wife didn't want me to do this. I did one for a magazine, a UK magazine, many years ago, where they were going to put me up with a skeptic, and a really hardened skeptic. And it was set up, and it was, I want to say it was like a double blind or a triple blind reading. And she didn't want me to do it because she said to me, Jock, if you do this and you don't get any information, that's you finished. They're going to put that there, they're going to print it, and it's going to go all over, and you'll get, this I think was in 2008. And of course, my ego took the best of me because I thought it was an opportunity. My book was coming out, and I'm sorry to say that, but the ego did take the best of me. So I was given a time, and then the connection was made from the editor at the time, and I gave a reading to this skeptic, and there was no back and forth, it was just yes, no. And nothing else.
Sounds like reading me, I'm sorry to say.
I was just like, I just had to give what I get. I came off of it, and I was crapping myself because I didn't know if it had gone well or anything else. And I was not allowed to know until the magazine article came out. So you can imagine that I was kind of worried a bit about it. But it did come out, and it was done fair, and it was well. Now, she didn't say that I changed her mind and totally convinced her, but she did admit that there was things that I gave her that nobody else would have known. So that for me, that was a success. So she said it's not convinced her entirely to change her whole perception or belief, but there was things in the sitting that I gave her that was just no way that would have been able to know unless I was connecting on the other side.
Always when you win over the skeptics, or, I know some mediums won me over as a pretty hardened skeptic, especially in my early days. And now physical mediumship.
Oh, yeah. I've had experiences with it. I'm also heavily involved in the Helen Duncan Foundation and through our organization, and some experiences have been extraordinary, some experiences not. So physical mediumship is the ability for a medium that will go into a deep level of trance and will basically what the hypothesis is, and I'm not, is that spirit will blend with that medium. There'll be a spirit team, and they will be able to manipulate forces around the medium and from the room and anything else around there to be able to create physical phenomena outside of, in a subjective manner, i.e. like the Fox sisters in the 1800s with raps on the wall, the doors, all that kind of stuff. Light anomalies, full materializations of loved ones. And for me, though, there's in physical mediumship, there's not the same level of evidence in the modern day that there was back in the days of like Helen Duncan or even trans mediums like Leonora Piper, whose mediumship was extraordinary, and some other well-known mediums back in the day. I mean, you also had Silver Birch Spirit Guide that came through in what's his name? I can't remember. It's terrible. My names. Who basically came through a medium back in the UK. So you had them. You had mediums from back in that day, and that evidence was not the same as there was in today's. It was completely different, completely unique. Helen Duncan was extraordinary medium.
What's the strongest evidence you've seen today?
I'm not going to give out any names because I don't want to support anyone or deny anyone, because there's a lot of negativity out there. But I did do a test of a medium many years ago, and I say one of the strongest pieces of evidence I actually had in front of 28 guests. After I even searched and strip searched the person, and you got to remember, I'm ex-military, so when I did searches, it was done properly. Was receiving an report in my hand from thin air that was told to me it was going to come, and a blinding flash of light, and it dropped right into my hand. And I will say that was probably the strongest evidence that I had. And here's the other thing that's really strange with this, Liz, is that nobody knew this when I was down to test them. And I connected with my spirit team on the other side, and I told them that I wanted a message. I told them that I wanted something from the other side. And it had to be, and nobody was to know. And I actually phoned someone that I knew, and I said, I'm driving down, I'm going down a test. Here's what I've asked for. Here's the what I want. Never asked what I was going to get. I just said I wanted to have that. And when I was called out, that was what I asked for was given. And they said that they knew that and they were giving me a gift for all the work that I had done for spirit, and to answer the questions that I had when I came down.
Anyone reads my book, my experience with physical mediumship was not something positive. Although,
no.
as you know, Jock, although I do think that there have been little moments like a port, I just have concluded that from my assessment, physical mediumship is overall a lot more subtle than the big dramatized shows. And genuine physical mediumship would have a harder time making money. It's just very beautiful and subtle. And you sit for 2 hours and maybe an object moves or reports or you hear voices.
But for me, that can be a bit of a show. What I want is evidence like Helen Duncan gave years ago, where loved ones come through, a Leslie Flint, who had full, evidence of loved ones that gave veridical evidence. I want that. That's missing.
Stuart Alexander seems to do that.
No, I haven't sat with Stuart Alexander, but I do know that he's got a very good reputation, and again, is very humble, and has had dramatic evidence over the years. Now, I can't corroborate that either way, but I've got no reason to deny that or not. And I've interviewed Stuart many years ago, and so I think he's one of the pioneers, I would say, of kind of maybe the modern day as well. But again, I mean, there's good and there's bad. I still don't think we have anybody of the level of Leslie Flint, Helen Duncan, Douglas Hume. We don't have any of them.
Why do you think that is? Because I always wonder why that is too. I'm like, have we just gotten better at detecting fraud and they were fraudulent?
I have a hypothesis that I call the Keurig effect. When you want a coffee these days, you go for a pod, you put it in, and you've got it immediately. And I think we're living in a time where we're not willing to give spirit the time that it needs to develop. We live in a time where technology is rampant, where the energies are not the same, and people are lazy. People want, I mean, let's face it, you can go now and take an online course and be a medium. I mean, I have witnessed this. I have witnessed someone, because they had a few hits, go on a mediumship course and a week later open up a business as a professional medium to teach other people mediumship. I mean, seriously. We developed old school. We developed in circle over years and years, and serving churches and things like that. That's not available these days. It's very much the Keurig effect. You put in a pod, you get a coffee, done. You want another flavor, you put it in, done. Nobody wants to wait or develop over years and years of development. And so I think that's a big issue.
And I know when I read Stuart Alexander's, remember he said they sat weekly for 10 years. I mean, to get anybody to do anything weekly aside from going to their paid job, I've tried to put these together.
Do you want to hear about the first time I heard about, I got my guide?
Yeah.
This is kind of scientific, right? Because, people will go for spirit guides and things. They'll say, anybody can turn around and say, hey, you've got a North American Indian. Hey, you've got an Egyptian. You've got but I believe you have to get evidence and stuff. Well, I remember, so we were sitting in circle in Scotland, and we'd been sitting for a long time. And there was at one point where we were sitting in circle, and I had gone out, and I had what I thought had fallen asleep. So, because I work with trance, and I developed I used to do deep trance in circle, and I've not done it for years and years and years because everything's gone on. But I kind of went out, and I went into deep trance. Now, bearing in mind, I didn't know this. I thought I fell asleep and stuff. When we came to, people were looking at me, and there was our scribe was taking notes and stuff like that. And they'd said, "Oh, your spirit guide came through." And my immediate reaction, Liz, was, "That's bollocks. That's a load of shit. There's no freaking way." But said no. Give the name and the details, and go and research. And the research was real, and the person that came through was identified and was a Native American, but also sat in councils in Congress years and years ago, I think in 1867. But the one thing that came through was another guide came through and gave his name as William Alexander, and had said that he was on a Titanic, but was not a member of staff, had the age that he was, and that he could be found on a manifesto as a passenger. And that was also verified, and a second time. And so I've always been one.
And you don't think there was some way in your childhood or years you maybe had read about these people and then made them up?
Was never interested in. No, I was never interested in it. Was never interested in North American Indians or anything like that. And then there was a gentleman come through in circle one night who mentioned, and I'd never heard of him, had mentioned the name that he was coming through to work with is called Arthur Ford. And I had never actually known of an Arthur Ford. And I'm not saying Arthur Ford is my guide or anything, so if anybody says anything like that, but he had come through and gave evidence, and that was verified as well. And that then, after that, and back there, I have one of his, I think it's a signed book that I managed to get out of an antique store that came to me in a really, really weird way. So I had evidence of the spirit team that was working with me, and verifiable evidence. And I've always maintained that anybody who's working with spirit guides has to have verifiable evidence.
I'm all for the verifiable. We're both there. There's one thing that you address in your book and in your approach that I really haven't heard other mediums say.
Oh, yeah, I know where you're going.
And it makes more sense to me.
I know where you're going.
You know where I'm going. That there's some really negative, dark non-local consciousness or discarnates. And I so often hear from people mediums, oh, it's only love on the other side. But I have a hard time believing it's only love because there's so many horrible people on this side. There's so many wonderful. I don't consider myself a negative person, but you can't go tell me like Donald Trump's going to go die and be like this loving, kind, wonderful, like non-local. He's probably going to be a total fuckhead for like a while until he evolves, if he evolves, or Putin or like some, serial killers, so.
All right. So yeah, I'm not well liked for this because there's so many mediums and so many organizations that think that everything in the rose garden is just roses and there's no weeds at all. But the reality is, here's the thing. We live in a world where we can see good and evil. Literally every day we can see it. And so, but here's the thing. It's something that we need because we only know good because we know what evil is. If there was only love that existed on the other side, nothing would where would there be any development? No, nothing would develop. If everything was perfect in its operation on the other side and there was no kind of polar opposites, how would even spirit guides or spirit develop or continue their development? At the end of the day, we live in a world of polar opposites. We have night and dark and it teaches us things. To be able to turn around and say that there is no evil on the other side or there is no negative spirits and everything in the garden is rosy is very foolhardy and stupid, because there's been plenty examples of negative spirits, of potential possessions, obsessions in history. And there's been phenomena, and even in physical mediumship, there have been discussions and teachings from the other side that say there is negativity on the other side, and that there's evil spirits that can hold them back and stuff like that. So to believe that everything is completely and utterly rosy on the other side is literally ludicrous.
I would agree, because it's not rosy here. And to think this is the one place where there's like dark stuff and everywhere else, like the next layer or dimension that we still connect with is perfect. That makes no sense to me either.
It don't. And the thing is, as a mediums that believe that, that's fine. I don't take that away from them, but it's kind of lulling them into a false sense of security. And I kind of think they do that because they're maybe frightened of the reality. And if they turn around and they say, but Jock, I've never experienced anything remotely negative like that, then, I applaud them because great, they never have. But what about people that have? And what about the suffering that happens there? And there is evidence on the other side that we have negative spirits. I mean, it's been spoken about in circles, and even in Helen Duncan's time, there was an example of that happened. And if you believe, we only know darkness because we understand light, and we only understand hate because we've touched love. We need polar opposites to teach us and to develop our soul. And even in ancient scriptures, I mean, if you're a Christian and you believe, in the third day he rose again, but he descended into hell and defeated hell. I mean, it's just an example, but in Muslim and different philosophies and different religious texts, I mean, you've got examples of that. And native cultures and all cultures, they have this. Why would we understand the existence of evil if it didn't exist? And what would we learn if there was nothing? I mean, if we all walked about in a continual love everywhere, we wouldn't need to develop. There was no reason to develop.
Can these negative consciousness, but can they harm us that much? Because if here, they can harm us from the most dramatic, profoundly life traumatizing ways with things such as murder at the worst, or, starting wars, which is mass murder, or they can just be that really irritating person. I think the majority of people are decent. A few are really good and a few are really bad. To what extent can these entities harm us?
To a great extent. And yes, they can hurt you. Well, you imagine, let's say, for instance, one of the greatest battlefields is the battlefield of the mind. So you imagine if there's a level of influence that influences you. Now that influence can cause you to do things drastic, take a life, cause suicide, anything like that. That's what I believe. Negative spirits can influence in such as a way that causes turmoil and suffering in this life. Now, if you want to talk about evil entities like malevolent intelligences, there's certain divine laws that they are governed by, just as we are governed by, and so they can't just run amok and just take everybody out or kill, or we'd have people being torn apart and God knows what else. But there's certain laws that are in operation that allow certain things to happen and obviously control things. But the biggest threat is influence. An influence of the mind, because that essentially is the battlefield. And when we have phenomena, I mean, there's been hauntings and poltergeist hauntings, and there's been a haunting that I wrote about years ago in Pennsylvania, and she broke her leg because she was pushed off the stairs, and literally, so a spirit can harm you. They're not allowed. I mean, not allowed to just kill you or anything. But the biggest thing I would say is the level of influence. Now, I have had. I'll be careful what I say. I have had mediums that are members of other organizations that have approached me quietly and secretly and said, "Don't let anybody know that I'm connecting with you, but this is what's happened to me, and I need help to deal with it because they've either opened up a door or they've dabbled a little bit they shouldn't have done." Or they've let their ego run riot and they've allowed a connection, or they've allowed things to take shape. And again, they've approached me to get help, and I've helped them, and I will keep them forever confidential. But I know that they're still involved in big organizations that deny the existence of anything remotely evil.
But what would these evil entities do? Let's say I work with someone annoying and they're like, oh, let's collaborate and try to get this other person fired because I don't like them. And you just know they're being an asshole. You just say, oh, no, thank you. And you walk away and not much harm done. And I feel like, given survival hypothesis is correct and there's wonderful and awful, like someone on the other side is like, oh, go do these really obnoxious things. You're just like, I mean, all of us have these weird thoughts. I think all of our brains are a little weird. And some days you're just like, I think we have a chronic dialogue of negative and positive and ethics and morals, and you don't act on every single thought. I mean, even stupid thoughts like, oh, I'm in such a rush, let me run this red light. I have those irritated thoughts. I don't do it. So so how are they that harmful?
Well, that's not. I mean, that's not really negative spirits influencing you. That's just, I mean, life. And you. I mean, there's a very thin line between psychosis and mental imbalance and what your thought process may be. Like for instance, an example in some of the research I do into prolonged grief disorder, the DSM-5 will say that anything grief longer than 6 months with a certain recipe means that you've got PGD. Well, that's rubbish. That's absolutely rubbish.
That gets me so mad. Yes, yes.
We've talked about it. So that is absolutely rubbish. So here's the thing: it's very, very, very rare, right? That this kind of phenomena and things like that happen. But the reality is the influence can happen. And one of the things I'll say that if a person is spiritually weak, then that gives the opportunity for it to occur. If you don't have a spiritual foundation, and that doesn't necessarily mean, look, religion, because you can have a spiritual foundation without following any religion. And so, but if you're spiritually weak, or you dabble in something, or you drop your spiritual strength by drugs, alcohol, whatever it is, then you can open yourself up to that potential. And once it's in, so it's almost like, let's say a virus gets into your system and your immune system can't thwart it. It spreads and spreads and spreads until eventually it starts to physically come out on you and, hey, you're ill, you've got a virus. So it's rather like that, right? If it's allowed in.
But what could they do to you? Like, okay, you gave the breaking of a leg as one example. I'm going to be honest, I hope I never break a leg, but I prefer breaking a leg, like, this is why I'm not that freaked out by dark non-local consciousness, because there's dark consciousness here too. And I prefer to have a broken leg and than my consciousness being completely obliterated. So that's why I'm not that bothered. I'm much happier that there's like good and evil and just like continuation of life in another form.
What would be the worst fear for you? How do I get into this? What would be the worst fear for you now? If you lost something now, and I'm not talking physically, right? If you lost something now, what would be that worst fear for you? How would you feel? Let's say Alzheimer's, right? Let's take that as an example. Imagine something like that. How would you think you would feel if you lost your mind or something affected your mind daily?
I don't know. That's hard to say. I immediately want to say, this is how I would guess I would feel if I was diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
So forget the Alzheimer's. Think about, that's an example. So think about how your mind as it is now and how you feel. Imagine that your mind was taken over. Imagine that it wasn't you. Imagine that every thought you were getting was nothing to do with you and was not a nice thought. How do you think you would feel?
That would be horrible.
Right.
It depends how strong my mind was. If I was aware that it was this annoying, again, you can have the annoying coworker who's an asshole, who's a very toxic person. You could just be like, okay, they're saying negative stuff to me all day and they're toxic and I see what they're doing. And you can be like, okay, right. I know who they are. And you go home to your boyfriend and best friends and you laugh about it. Or you could be like, best friend them and be in a toxic best friendship, which I've had in my life.
So imagine then that what you're getting in your mind every day, every moment is nothing but evil and you can't think straight. You can't. That's what I said. The battlefield is in the mind.
How bad is the evil? Is it go murder people?
Yeah, it could be anything.
Or is it, oh, you're not successful, you're ugly,
No, I mean listen, we all get them.
Yeah, okay. I was like, I've had those. Yeah, okay, but it's like go murder people.
I'll give you an example. I was on a case many, many years ago that involved a potential obsession. And here's the weird thing is that every time I get a really serious case, which is very, very few and far between real ones, I always dream about them 3 days before, which is really strange. But I remember that when I was dealing with this, I started to get real negative feelings and experiences in my mind continually. And I mean really bad. And it wasn't me, and I knew it wasn't me. And because I had this mediumistic ability, I knew that it was coming from elsewhere. But to the point that it was causing me so much anxiety and anguish and fear and suffering, I remember being on my knees and praying to the divine to take away the suffering. I remember being in tears, and because it would not stop. And so if you imagine somebody who's suffering, who's continually barraged with evil thoughts and negativity, that's the worst thing. The only freedom that you really have in this world is your mind. Nobody can take that away from you, and you guard that with everything. So if your mind is being penetrated and taken away from you, that's the worst. That's worse than breaking a leg. It's worse than being, shot or anything else. And even people that are once maybe a negative spirit gets in, I believe that there's a lot of suicides out there are fueled by spirits on the other side that are negative and can fuel that. And I've seen examples of that. And I've been in a mental hospital where I was interviewing someone, where I was helping someone who was actually in the hospital because of things that were happening in her mind. And she was very mediumistic, actually. I wrote about it in my first book. But so I think the battlefield is definitely in your mind. If your mind is not yours and it's constantly being interrupted and it's bad and it's evil, it goes against the nature of who you are. It goes against the nature of this loving being that you're really effectively going to be. And you have a choice. God gave us a beautiful gift of choice. And some people who don't have a spiritual foundation are more adept at having their mind influenced. But if you like I was in that case, it was constant, and it wasn't me, and it was bad, and it was really making it feel really, really bad, really negative. And that's a level of suffering that I wouldn't wish on anyone. And I had to go through that at the time to be able to learn how to discern and how to cope with what I do now when people do come to me for help. But it's the worst feeling. If your mind was not yours, Liz, and it was constantly filled with evil thoughts, and you were so disconnected and disorientated, and you were so distanced from something that was good and pure and loving, that's the worst thing that I could even postulate for anyone.
That sounds horrible. I have first of all, do you think people, I have a few more questions about this. Do you think somebody who just does remarkable evil, like Hitler or Charles Manson, serial killers, school shooters, do you think that is what's happened to them?
Well, let's talk about Jeffrey Dahmer. I believe Jeffrey Dahmer is pure evil, and I believe he's influenced, right? Because there seems to be no human emotion there at all that I can see, and maybe my hypothesis would be that there was a level of influence in him that was allowed to grow and take over. And I mean, it's horrible to even think of what he did in the cases he did. And I think there's a lot of murderers at that level. And, I'm studying psychology and stuff like that. And yes, we have the capacity to have mental imbalance and physical, biological imbalances in the brain and stuff like that. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, if we are then postulating that the mind is that the brain is an expression of the mind, it doesn't matter if they've got an imbalance in their circuitry, because that expression is only coming from the mind. If the mind is then infiltrated and obsessed, then of course it could be like that. Of course they could actually be influenced, and the murderers and things that we have, they could be influenced. I mean, these are intelligences that are beyond our perception in this world.
So are they, like, let's say after Jeffrey Dahmer passes away, is that an example of what these entities are? Are they discarnate humans who were terrible people here, who go on and continue that type of cruelty and brutality?
I don't like to use this term because this gets laughed at and this gets poked at a lot. But I believe there are demoniacal spirits. And
were they ever human or no?
No, I don't believe they were human. I do believe there's negative spirits on the other side that were human, that have, maybe have remained grounded, or are living the life of Riley and still causing, things over there. But remember, they're still governed by divine law, as is demoniacal spirits. And I don't like to use the term demon, because man has literally labeled that as there. And if we go back into it, it goes way into Greek and Latin and all sorts of things. But I like to use the term a malevolent intelligence, because it's an intelligence that has its intelligence. Yeah, it's less biblical. So I believe it is a malevolent intelligence. And if you want to label that as demon, then fine. If that's the way that we understand it, then fine, let's do that. I have had experiences that go beyond science of malevolent intelligences.
The one you described.
Well, even worse. I've had worse than that. I've had real experiences that.
Would you be comfortable sharing or no?
Some of them I wouldn't, and they're few and far between. But I remember I remember many years ago. I was in this hotel, and my wife and I were sleeping. And it was before my first book. It was before Deadly Departed came out. And I had been doing some research and stuff like that. You got to remember when you dive into these things. And I was involved in a case that I won't go into and disclose. But I remember that I found it difficult to sleep. And during the night, I smelled this putrid smell. And then I witnessed objectively a figure a dark mist that materialized, and I could see. And then before I knew it, I had my name was being called out, and I mean outside of myself, objectively. And people might say, "This is you're just making it up and everything else," but it was terrifying. And I was held down, and I was choked on my bed. I was held down. I was scratched, and the bed was vibrating and shaking. My wife was sitting next to me. She was sleeping next to me. She was out. She couldn't even. And the bed there was nothing coming around. She was shaking. And cut a long story short, basically, then I would remember I was trying to pray, and I couldn't get any prayer out, and I was being choked in my throat, through here and held down. It wasn't narcolepsy or anything else because I was aware, right? I was totally aware, and this figure got really close in, and I could literally smell this right on me. It was horrible, and then I saw, I heard growling like dogs that was terrible, and it was in my ear as well. It was really horrible, and my name was being called out all the time. And I remember I virtually then, I just managed to get enough strength to pray and call on Archangel Michael, as it was, that I called out, because that's what I knew to do. And all of a sudden there was this change, and there was this implosion. There was like this vacuum, this sucking, and there was like a little spark of energy. I don't want to say an orb, because it wasn't an orb or anything. It was just like a spark of energy. And if you imagine a vacuum that just goes and sucks up kind of very quickly, and then everything just disappeared. That mist disappeared. Everything else and everything in the room went totally. Everything felt really calm, but I was really shaken. I remember, waking Jo up and telling her what happened, and I was really shaken about it. And the covers had been pulled off and everything of the bed and stuff like that. So, I think that was a warning for me. It was a case that I was dealt with, and there was phenomena that happened. No, it was phenomena that happened on there, and a good friend of mine is Dr. Richard Gallagher, who is a psychiatrist. He was a psychiatrist at one of the main universities, and he wrote a book on demons. He wrote a book on the researches he did as a psychiatrist and what he was involved in with the Catholic Church. And he said some real experiences. So him and I have talked about this, and I think to this day I'm probably the only medium that he respects. That has got. It took me. I mean, he supported my book, Deadly Departed, but it took a long time with him and I arguing about different things and religion and the Catholic Church and everything else. But we've become quite good friends, and to have someone that that's experienced phenomena that's outside of the science as well, and at the level that he is as a psychiatrist. There's definitely something there, and not everybody, and any demonic experiences or any spiritual experiences is few and far between. There's not a lot. I mean, you take 100 cases, you'll be lucky if one case is actually real. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. I never asked to get into this field of that type of stuff. It's not something I wanted, but it always seemed to follow me and find me.
So, do you think these malevolent non-local consciousness or discarnate beings are permanently horrible? Because here, for example, you'll hear about prison rehabs. Are these redeemable beings that evolve and grow, or is this their permanent state?
I'll answer that in a minute. Ladies and gentlemen, anybody's going to come back to me and says, he didn't even know who Silverbridge was. It was Maurice Barbanel. The name just came to my mind. My mind went blank earlier. Maurice Barbanel, Silverbridge, okay? That's who I meant to remember, and I just came to mind. Okay, so answering your question. So here's the thing, Liz. We don't have all the answers. And what I tell you, somebody else could deny, or what I can only go on what I know from experience. I understand divine law really deeply. Could I turn around and say these spirits have I would say, here's the thing. I would say there is a potential for that. But I cannot give a definitive answer to say that, yes, they can become good unless they can transform. In the same way as we can transform through grief, not everybody does transform and have a transformative experience on the grieving journey, but there is a potential for transformation. So I think the best thing that I can say is that there is a potential that I understand that could be, but I don't have all the answers of everything on the other side. And far be it for me to even categorically say this is real, this is true, and this is the way that, and you should believe me and not only me. That would be very egotistical and wrong of me to do so. So I would say that the potential exists from my experience. But again, would that potentially happen? I don't know. Maybe there's a hypothesis that these beings are here as part of what needs to teach us and help us to develop. Or did they? I mean, I definitely I'm not a believer, or if you like, a perceiver of the big fight in heaven that Satan was thrown down to hell and all this kind of thing. I like to think about it as consciousness, intelligences. That kind of sits with me more scientifically than that kind of thing. So I would like to say that the potential exists, and until that potential is explored or actually has evidence of that, I will say it just exists as a potential.
I guess last question about this evil, and then one final science question. So could the reverse not be true as well? You get someone who's born here who's kind of a pretty cruel-hearted person, like a Hitler type, or maybe not even as extreme as Hitler. Like, I'm not saying this is at all okay, but it's not mass genocide, but like a rapist or, someone who robs stores and beats up people. I'm saying those are horrible things to do, but it's not Hitler. But could good beings on the other side jump in and take over their brain?
Absolutely.
Because I know it when I'm on the other side. I would love to go take over someone's brain who wants to go hurt others and be like, don't do that, don't hurt them. And, I'm not even the best person. I'm like petty as fuck. And I still don't like to see anyone get hurt.
Yeah, don't we all? I mean, here's this very simple response to that. Anybody who's like, say, why do you pray? You pray for an intervention.
I don't.
Right? Well, most people out there that pray, well, I mean, you say you don't, but I bet you do, and you don't even think about it, right? Because maybe.
True. I always try to connect to my dad, my grandma, Fran, my mentor, my animals. I try to send good energy to things. I try to go out of body. Yeah.
Right. So essentially that's a form of prayer, because you can sit and look at, you could sit, Liz, and you could sit with a rose and look at a rose, and then in your mind you go, oh God, isn't that beautiful? Right? It doesn't mean that you turn around and you say, oh, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, or Our Father who art in heaven. It means, oh God, isn't that beautiful? Well, that's a form of prayer, right? Because the intention is there that you've become aware of something that is beauty in the world, something that holds a divine spark, and you have been gratuitous for that. And in that moment, you have a recognition of that, and so your thought process then is prayerful. You are praying essentially, because in that moment you're connected to it. So that's. People think that prayer is just words that are spoken glibly, but your whole mind and body and soul has to go into it. So I would venture you do pray, you just do it in your own way and just differently. And you may call it an invocation, or you may call it a recognition, but in the same way, we'll say it's a prayerful intent. So when people have that prayerful intent, they're praying for an intervention of something good. Oh, God, help me. Oh, Jesus, help me. Or Dad on the other side, help me. We're praying for an intervention. We're praying for something good to influence us, to help us. So, yeah, I do believe that, we can be, a negative person can be influenced by good. It brings this analogy, right? Remember the analogy? Remember watching Tom and Jerry, the cartoons years ago, and you would have Tom with the devil on one shoulder and the angel on another shoulder, and the kind of idea was that one was influencing the other, and they were battling each other to get the kind of good ear. So yes, I do believe. I won't say I believe because I don't like the word believe, but I do know that we can also be influenced by good. And someone who's committed acts of atrocity everyone has the potential to feel the power of forgiveness. Now, notice I never said a skill. A power of forgiveness is a divine power. Everybody has that potential, but that doesn't mean to say that they'll escape they'll still have to go through a process of atoning for what they did. But there is the potential to seek that power of forgiveness. And so I do believe that, and I've known people who have been in prison and come out and have done amazing things in the world and served. So of course, the potential is always there, but there's always this element of free will, and there's always this element of choice. And so, if we can be influenced by evil, then we can be influenced by good. It is the polar opposites, and the potential of both is there.
And then, I think that's a beautiful ending to about the evil spirits. And then lastly, because we're both science people, what do you think is the strongest scientific evidence of an afterlife?
You know what? Everybody's going to expect me to turn around and say mediumship and the evidence that you get, and physical evidence and things like that. I'm going to say, and people might get shocked at this, reincarnation. Because there's so much veridical evidence of reincarnation that Dr. Ian Stevenson had studied in the Division of Perceptual Studies, and I think there's cases there that beyond mediumship are so spectacular. And there's a show I think on Netflix. I think I told you about it. There's a show on Netflix called The Ghosts Inside My Children, and go and watch it, guys, because it's fascinating. And I would say that evidence, for me particularly, is absolutely phenomenal of the other side. Not floating trumpets and not mental mediumship, but I think the reincarnation experience that has evidence connected to it, for me, I think is one of the most potent evidences of the continuation of consciousness on the other side.
Dr. Jim Tucker was the first bit of research that opened my mind up to this possibility.
Well, all right. Excellent.
Let's end on remind everyone the names of your books, your podcast, and where our listeners can find you.
Okay, so I have two podcasts. One that has been launched recently called The Pillars of Grief, which is just all about grief and my research into grief and my work with those in grief. And Deadly Departed, where it used to be just about my book, Deadly Departed, but has evolved into a really good podcast where I interview scientists and researchers, and we get into the nitty-gritty things, and we still talk about paranormal stuff as well. You can connect with me at I've got two sites, one jockbrocas.com, which is my work in grief, and evidentialmedium.com, which is my work on mediumship and the afterlife and stuff like that. But what I will say to you, ladies and gentlemen, is just test everything and don't just believe anything I say or anything anybody else says. Bring science and a science mind into everything, even your mediumship, your spirituality. There's a place for both. And I'm not saying that there's evil demons running around the place and waiting to take you over. There's divine laws that govern things, and understand that. But as I said just recently, the potential exists. And just because you don't believe in a malevolent intelligence doesn't exist based on the premise of your belief, but they believe in you.
And I'll add to that, if you're questioning just because you don't believe in an afterlife, that doesn't mean it's not true. So don't lose hope. It's the evidence. And to me, again, having some malevolent beings around the way there are here just seems like part of being conscious, and significantly better than complete conscious obliteration, because we're already dealing with malevolence here as well as love. And I'll
Yeah.
take that significantly over obliteration and non-existence. So thank you so much, Jacques. I appreciate it.
I've loved being your guest. Thank you so much. You've been a fantastic host, and I hope this helps other people. And if they've got any questions, they can reach out to me. But I can't wait to see what's coming up for both of us in the future, and certainly with all research and I'm doing as well.
Hey everyone! I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There, you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey-Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFJustHappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?